the shadows of history, a dark truth lurks. Ancient China, a land of beauty and wisdom, also harbored a chilling secret. Punishments so brutal, so unimaginable, they were definitely not for the faint of heart. Brace yourselves as we delve into the forbidden depths of ancient justice. What you're about to see may disturb you. We are starting off this list today talking about Lingchi, or death by 1,000 cuts. This was an ancient Chinese execution method that was as gruesome as it sounds. Imagine being tied up to a post and then having small pieces of your flesh sliced off, one excruciating cut at a time. This wasn't a quick process either. It was designed to be a slow, agonizing ordeal that could last for hours, with the executioner methodically removing flesh to prolong the torment. Used for the worst of the worst crimes like treason, this punishment was meant to be a deterrent, a very visible yet horrifying show of what happens when you seriously betray the empire. Banned in the early 20th century, this brutal practice is just a reminder of how far punishment has evolved from the days when making a spectacle of suffering was the norm. Next, we are talking about nose removal. Cutting off someone's nose might sound like a bit of a bizarre punishment today, but back in ancient China, this was serious business. Known as yi, this penalty was one of the big five in the old school Chinese justice system, along with other cheerful options like tattooing and chopping off feet. More on that later. Picture you're living in the Western Zoo period around the 11th to the 8th century BCE, and yi is all the rage for punishing the bad guys, especially the ones who couldn't break into a city during a siege. This nose-chopping business wasn't just a random act of cruelty, it sat smack in the middle of the punishment scale, tougher than getting some ink on your face as a permanent mark of shame, but not quite as harsh as losing a foot. It first pops up in the Zuli, a classic text on rituals, but it's even scribbled on ancient bones. As time rolled on, especially during the chaotic spring and autumn period from the 8th to the 5th century BCE, people started to cool off on the whole nose-cutting thing, but it of course made a comeback during the Warring States period and the Qin dynasty from the 5th century to 206 BCE. Back then, if you were a soldier or an official who messed up big time, like failing to capture a city, you might find yourself a bit lighter in the nose department. Sometimes they'd really go to town and combine this with other punishments like the tattooing just to add insult to injury. But then Emperor Wen of the Han dynasty came along around 180 to 157 BCE, and he was like, hey, maybe we should just chill out a little bit on the mutilations. He swapped out the nose cutting for a whopping 300 hits with a light stick, which honestly doesn't sound much better, but it's definitely a start. Despite the official ban, this gruesome tradition stuck around in practice here and there, sneaking into the southern and northern dynasties around 300 to 600 CE, and even into the time of the Jurchen Jin dynasty, up to the 13th century. Next, we are talking about boiling to death. Okay, it might sound like a gruesome method cooked up from a horror movie, but it was a very real and terrifying punishment in ancient China, particularly for heinous crimes like killing your own parents. A huge cauldron would be filled with boiling water or oil, and the condemned person would be slowly lowered into it. It's definitely as nightmarish as it sounds, like a scene straight out of a medieval tale, designed to inflict maximum pain and draw out the suffering. This wasn't just about punishing a crime, it was about sending a chilling message to anyone who might dare to commit such a taboo. The authorities used this method to show the power and reach of the law in a way that was as visually shocking and morally horrifying. So next time you're impatiently watching a pot of water boil, spare a thought for the poor souls of ancient times, for whom that bubbling cauldron represented a much darker fate. Next, we are talking about being crushed by elephant. This over-the-top execution method wasn't originally a Chinese invention. It was actually borrowed from nearby cultures and countries like India and Southeast Asia, where elephants were abundant and had a long history of being part of royal courts and armies. Elephants were symbols of royal power and majesty, so using them as tools of execution added a layer of terrifying spectacle to this punishment. Here's how this horrific spectacle would would typically unfold. It would start off with the condemned's last walk. The offender, often a prisoner of war or someone guilty of a severe crime like killing or treason, would be led out into a large open space. This space was usually a public area because yes, this was a public execution meant to scare anyone else who might think of breaking the law. Then enter the elephant. A trained execution elephant, which could be as big as 10 feet tall at the shoulder, would be brought in. These weren't your friendly circus elephants, they were trained to kill. The elephant trainer would direct the elephant, often from a seat right on its back. And then finally, the crushing would take place. On a given signal, the elephant would raise its massive foot and then bring it down onto the condemned. Sometimes, to prolong the agony, the elephant would slowly roll its foot back and forth over the body. Other times, the execution was quick, with the elephant delivering a single, bone-crushing blow. The use of an elephant was not just about the physical destruction that it could cause, it was also a deeply psychological method of instilling fear. The very sight of such a giant beast being used as an instrument of death was enough to make anyone think twice about crossing the line. Elephants are extremely intelligent and can be trained, making them more predictable and manageable in crowded execution scenarios. Next, we are talking about the wooden collar. So imagine being stuck in a giant, heavy wooden board that wraps around your neck like the world's worst fashion accessory. That is the wooden collar for you, an ancient Chinese punishment that was both a physical and a social torment. Offenders had this massive square board with a hole just big enough for their head locked onto their necks. This clumsy collar made it impossible to eat or drink without help, turning every meal into a public spectacle of dependence and shame. People wearing the collar were often left in public places where the passerby could see their humiliation. And this also wasn't just a quick timeout. We're talking about days, weeks, or even months of lugging this lumbering frame around. It was kind of like a mobile prison that advertised your crime everywhere you went, a constant reminder to others and to yourself about the consequences of breaking the law. Imagine trying to sleep or even just rest with this bulky board. Talk about a literal nightmare. Next, we are talking about foot amputation. Imagine getting caught for a robbery and instead of jail time, they just take your foot off. That's exactly how ancient China when it came to punishing criminals. Foot amputation was a brutally effective way to handle thieves and burglars. Think about it. If you're missing a foot, sneaking around or running away after a heist isn't exactly easy. This harsh punishment served as a gruesome deterrent, sending a clear message to anyone thinking about breaking the law. Steal stuff? Lose a foot. It was about making sure that repeat offenses were next to impossible. Next, we are talking about exile. In ancient China, if you messed up big time, especially if you were a big shot, you might find yourself slapped with a one-way ticket to nowhere. Exile was a go-to punishment for high flyers who broke the rules. Instead of throwing you in a cell, they'd send you off to the most desolate, unfriendly corners of the country. Imagine being uprooted from your cozy life and dropped into a place with harsh weather, rough terrain, and none of the comforts of home. You'd have to fend for yourself in a land where the locals weren't exactly throwing welcome parties for exiled criminals. This punishment wasn't just about getting you out of sight, it was about stripping you of your status and forcing you to survive in a place where your fancy title meant zilch. Next, we are talking about flogging with a heavy whip. Kind of specific. Now, this wasn't just any old whip. We're talking about a massive, heavy-duty whip made of buffalo leather. This thing was tough, mean, and all kinds of painful. The buffalo leather made the whip thick and weighty, ensuring that each lash wasn't just a sting, but a deep bruising impact that could break skin and leave serious marks. You'd be brought out in front of a crowd because, let's face it, punishments back then were also about sending a message to everyone else. Don't do what this guy did. You'd be tied up, often to a post or sometimes just forced to lay down, making sure you couldn't wiggle your way out of what was coming. The executioner, a guy who is usually pretty burly because swinging that heavy whip was no easy task, would then start the flogging. Based on what you did, the number of lashes would be decided. Stole something minor, maybe like 10 lashes. Something more severe, we could be talking 50, 100, or even more lashes. Each lash from the heavy whip wasn't just a simple hit. The thick buffalo leather could cause gashes, tear into muscle, and even break bones if the hit was in the right spot. If the crime was really serious, the number of lashes could be high enough that the person wouldn't survive. The absolute horror, a punishment that starts out as painful and ends up as lethal. Next, we are talking about the facial tattooing. This was like the ultimate walk of shame. It wasn't like your cool hipster tattoo. This was a big, bold label like thief or traitor inked right onto your forehead, your cheek, sometimes even just the whole thing. First off, this wasn't just a quick in and out at the tattoo parlor, you know, a little walk-in. The process was painful. They used natural dyes, maybe soot or ink, and a needle to etch the words into your skin. There were no numbing creams, of course, so you felt every poke and prod of that needle. The idea was all about shame and prevention. In a time where your reputation was everything, having thief tattooed on your face was a serious blow. It wasn't just a punishment for the crime you committed, it was a lifelong reminder to you and everyone else that you crossed the line. Plus, again, like a lot of these, it was a major deterrent. If you saw someone with thief tattooed on their face, would you hire them? Trust them? Probably not. So this was a way to keep people in line by fear of public humiliation. Having such a tattoo made life incredibly hard. It wasn't like you could just move to another city and start fresh. Your face preceded you everywhere you went. Finding a job, making friends, or even just buying groceries without being judged or shunned was nearly impossible. And finally on this list today, we are talking about hair cutting. Now let me tell you about one of ancient China's more unusual punishments that didn't involve physical torment, but was still pretty harsh. Cutting someone's hair. Now, before you shrug it off as a minor penalty, let me set the scene to explain why this was such a big deal back then. In ancient China, your hair was more than just a personal style statement. It was a symbol of your dignity and respect for your ancestors. Confucian teachings emphasized the importance of preserving your body as it was given by your parents, which included your hair. So cutting someone's hair wasn't just a makeover, it was a major sign of disgrace. If someone committed a crime, especially a minor one, the authorities might chop off their hair instead of throwing them in jail or giving them the bamboo treatment. This hair cutting was like a walking billboard saying, "Hey, look at me, I did something wrong." In a culture that valued honor and appearance, this was absolutely brutal. Also, we have to remember, family was everything. If you came home with your hair cut off, you weren't just in trouble, you actually disgraced your entire family. Dinner time would definitely get pretty awkward, and family gatherings? Forget about it. You'd be the talk of the town, and not in a good way. It's definitely a hair-raising tale that shows sometimes the simplest penalties can carry the heaviest weights in the right context. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I will see you again soon. Bye!